There's something deeply wrong about clocks at night. During the day, they're harmless little machines. Background noise. Tiny dictators organizing meetings and dentist appointments. But after midnight? Every tick sounds like proof that something is hunting you. Time is strange because nobody actually sees it. You see movement. Decay. A candle shrinking into wax. A child turning into an old man. A civilization becoming ruined, swallowed by weeds. But time itself? Invisible. And for thousands of years humanity has stared into that invisible river, wondering one forbidden question. Can it be crossed? Tonight, we descend into one of the strangest rabbit holes ever carved into modern mythology. Not just the science of time travel. Not just the theories. But the stories. The people who claimed they'd already done it. Men who appeared online with knowledge they shouldn't have had. Government whistleblowers describing secret teleportation projects. Alleged chrononauts wandering through history like tourists wearing stolen futures. Some of these stories are obvious hoaxes. Some are psychological puzzles. And some remain disturbingly difficult to explain. This is Stranger Thangs. Before we get into alleged time travelers, we need to understand something important. Human beings have always hated being trapped inside time. Ancient myths are filled with stories that resemble time dilation long before physics existed. In Japanese folklore, there's the legend of Urashima Taro, a fisherman who visits an underwater palace for what feels like a few days. When he returns home, centuries have passed. In Irish mythology, travelers enter fairy mounds and emerge to find entire generations gone. Even in the Bible, there are passages scholars interpret as altered states of time perception. Humanity has been haunted by temporal weirdness forever. But then, science entered the chat carrying dynamite. In 1905, Albert Einstein detonated reality with the theory of relativity. And suddenly time was no longer fixed. It could stretch, bend, slow down. According to relativity, time passes differently depending on gravity and velocity. The faster you move through space, the slower you move through time. Which means time travel already exists. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station technically experience microscopic time dilation. They age slightly slower than people on Earth. Not science fiction. Measured fact. The universe itself permits movement into the future. Just not backward. At least, not easily. Now we enter the dangerous part of the maze. Because physics doesn't entirely forbid time travel. It merely punishes anyone trying to understand it. Let's break down the major theories. 1. Wormholes. Imagine folding a sheet of paper. Two distant points suddenly touch. That's the basic idea behind a wormhole. A shortcut through space-time. In theory, if one end of a wormhole experienced time differently than the other, stepping through it could move you into the past or future. The problem? Wormholes are unstable. Most equations suggest they'd collapse instantly unless stabilized with exotic matter, which sounds less like science and more like something a cult leader stores in a basement freezer. Still, the math doesn't completely reject the idea. Which is unsettling. 2. Black holes. Black holes distort spacetime so severely that time itself slows dramatically nearby. If someone orbited close enough to a black hole and survived, they might experience hours while decades passed elsewhere. This is essentially the premise behind Interstellar. And the wild part? That movie consulted real physicists. The terror was mathematically flavored. 3. Cosmic strings. Some theoretical physicists propose that ultra-dense strands of energy left over from the Big Bang could warp spacetime enough to create closed time-like curves. Which sounds fake. It sounds like a rejected comic book plot. But again, the equations don't entirely say no. 4. The Tipler Cylinder. Physicist Frank Tipler proposed that an infinitely long rotating cylinder could twist spacetime into loops. The catch? You'd need an infinite cylinder, which creates a tiny engineering inconvenience. Still, it remains one of the strangest legitimate solutions in theoretical physics. 5. Quantum time travel. Now we arrive at the truly brain-melting stuff. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest all possible timelines exist simultaneously, meaning time travel may not alter your own past. It may simply move you into another branch of reality. A parallel world. Another timeline. Another Earth. Which becomes very important later when we discuss John Titor, because his explanation depends entirely on this concept. Every time travel discussion eventually crashes into the same wall. The paradoxes. The most famous is the grandfather paradox. If you travel into the past and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you are never born. But if you're never born, who traveled back in time? This logical deadlock led physicists towards several terrifying possibilities. The universe prevents paradoxes somehow. Changing the past creates alternate timelines. Free will itself may be an illusion. And honestly, none of those options feel emotionally healthy. In late 2000, a user appeared on internet forums claiming to be a soldier from the year 2036. His name? John Titor. And this story spread across the early internet like radioactive fog. Titor claimed he was part of a military operation involving time travel technology developed by General Electric. According to him, his mission was to travel back to 1975 and retrieve an IBM 5100 computer needed to debug future systems. Already weird. But then things became deeply unsettling. Titor described future events in chilling detail. A coming American civil conflict. Global instability. Nuclear war in 2015. A fractured United States. Localized communities replacing centralized systems. He also described how time travel supposedly worked. According to Titor, traveling backward created divergences between world lines. Meaning he wasn't visiting our past exactly. He was entering a closely related timeline. Convenient explanation for failed predictions? Absolutely. But here's why people remain fascinated. Some of his technical claims about the IBM 5100 were allegedly obscure and later validated by engineers familiar with hidden features of the machine. Now, skeptics argue this information could have been discovered by dedicated researchers. And they're probably right. But the atmosphere surrounding Titor was different from typical hoaxes. He wrote calmly, methodically, almost clinically. Not like a prankster. More like someone filing field reports from the apocalypse. Even stranger? He vanished. No grand reveal. No monetization. No book deal. No dramatic finale. Just silence. Like a radio transmission cut off mid-sentence. And to this day, people still debate whether John Titor was a performance artist, a collective storytelling experiment, a psychological phenomenon, or something far stranger. If John Titor felt like digital folklore, Andrew Basiago feels like conspiracy theory fermented under government fluorescent lights. Basiago claims that as a child he participated in a secret DARPA program called Project Pegasus. According to him, the US government developed teleportation and time travel technologies decades ago. And not only that, children were allegedly used because their minds handled temporal displacement better than adults. Which sounds exactly like the opening of a horror film Nobody Survives. Basiago's claims include teleportation chambers, trips to historical events, visits to future timelines, encounters with future presidents, even alleged experiences on Mars. Yes, Mars. And before you dismiss this entirely, Understand why these stories grip people. Basiago presents himself not like a raving prophet, but like an attorney giving testimony. Calm. Structured. Detailed. That tone creates psychological power. Because humans instinctively trust specificity. The more detail someone gives, the more believable they feel. Even when the claims are extraordinary. Critics point out obvious inconsistencies and lack of evidence. And scientifically, his claims collapse under scrutiny. But culturally? Stories like Basiago's matter because they reveal something profound. People desperately want to believe governments know more than they admit. Especially about reality itself. The rabbit hole only gets darker from here. Rudolph Fentz. One famous urban legend tells of a man appearing in Times Square in the 1950s wearing outdated 1800s clothing before being struck by a car. Supposedly, items in his pockets confirmed he was from another century. The problem? The story appears fictional. Likely originating from a sci-fi short story later mistaken for fact. But the myth persists because it feels plausible enough to infect memory. The Mobley Jourdain incident. In 1901, two women visiting Versailles claimed they slipped into another time. They described encountering people in antique clothing and bizarre atmospheric distortions before later realizing some details matched the era of Marie Antoinette. Was it hallucination? Misremembering? Shared delusion? Or something stranger lurking in specific locations? Places where reality folds thin like burnt paper? The man from Tord. Perhaps the creepiest alleged case. A man arrives at a Japanese airport carrying documents from a country called Tord. A nation that does not exist. But according to him, it absolutely does. He becomes confused when shown maps. Then supposedly vanishes from a secured hotel room. Again. The evidence for this story is extremely shaky. But stories like these persist because they exploit one of humanity's deepest fears. What if reality is less stable than we think? Now we move away from alleged machines and toward phenomena sometimes called time slips. These are spontaneous experiences where people claim reality briefly shifted. Common patterns include sudden silence, atmospheric distortion, outdated architecture, people in antique clothing, an overwhelming sense that something is wrong. Then suddenly, everything snaps back. There are hundreds of reports worldwide. Most can likely be explained through psychology, memory errors, dissociation, or environmental confusion. But not all stories fit neatly into those categories. Especially cases involving multiple witnesses. And that's where things become difficult. Because humans are unreliable observers. But collective anomalies are harder to dismiss. Not impossible. Just harder. There's a strange argument often made online. If time travel exists in the future, where are all the tourists? It's a fair question. Unless they're already here and carefully avoiding detection. Or history itself resists alteration. Or traveling backward is heavily restricted. Or every visitor gets buried beneath conspiracy forums and dismissed as lunatics. Which honestly might be the perfect camouflage. Imagine being an actual time traveler trying to warn humanity. You'd end up arguing with anonymous users named Shadowwolf for 20. No wonder they'd give up. Here's the truth buried underneath all this strange mythology. Time travel stories aren't really about science. They're about regret. Human beings are creatures haunted by memory. We replay conversations, mistakes, deaths, missed opportunities. We fantasize about changing timelines because emotionally, we already do it every day. What if I'd said something different? What if I'd stayed? What if I'd left sooner? Time travel is grief wearing a lab coat. And maybe that's why these stories never die. Because every human being secretly wants one impossible thing. Another chance. Somewhere tonight, a clock just stopped. Somebody noticed. Most people didn't. That's the unsettling thing about time. We assume it's stable because we need it to be. But physics tells us it bends. Memory tells us it lies. And stories. Stories whisper that sometimes it breaks. Maybe John Titor was a hoax. Maybe Andrew Basiago invented an elaborate fantasy. Maybe every alleged chrononaut was simply another lost soul trying to matter in a noisy world. Or maybe, just maybe, history is less secure than we think. Maybe reality has seams. Tiny fractures. And every once in a while, someone slips through. Until next time. Lock your doors. Check your shadows. And if someone claims they're from the future, ask them what happens tomorrow. I have been your guide, Malachi. And this is Stranger Thangs.